Sometimes the most loving thing to do for a person is to tell them the truth, not to pull away the consequences from them. If you have a friend, or not even a friend, just a human being, that they are actively running towards a cliff, the most loving thing for you to tell that person is you're running off a cliff and you shouldn't do that, and you should get in their way to stop them from running off the cliff. They're an image bearer of God, and we're supposed to protect human life, and so you're to stop them from running off the cliff. Good morning, Idaho. Welcome to the Local Yokel Idaho podcast, where we talk about what is going on in the wonderful state of Idaho. For those tuning in for the first time, I'd like to have a little banter before we get into the stories, but I understand if you're short on time, so we have provided the timestamps in the description so you can jump straight to the stories you're interested in. For those that stayed, welcome. Glad to have you here. Hope you are having a wonderful day. I know this week's show is going to be a great one. We've got a little bit more of the format figured out. And on top of that, thank you for any new-time listeners that are here. We've gotten in a lot of support this week. I've seen the subscriber numbers go up, and the views specifically on YouTube this last week have been great. So thank you for that growth. And for anybody that's new, welcome. Hopefully you enjoyed last week's and you'll enjoy this one as well. With that said, before I get any further in it, John, the editor for the show, is co-hosting with me again today.
Yep, I am once again here, and yeah, it has been exciting watching people watch our stuff. It still blows my mind that anybody would want to listen to me talk or anything like that. But, you know, I've thought about that with the podcasts I've had and with other videos I've done, and also as in my professional career. Also, I was talking with my wife earlier about just my knowledge of what's going on in Idaho, and I know a whole lot more than I used to because I now am forced to pay attention to it. So that also has been a good thing. So, Tyler, I have benefited greatly from this show also. So thank you.
Well, I'm glad. That's the hope. That's the dream, especially for the viewer. And it's also very glad to hear that someone who's so close to it, you're learning and getting to understand it. I have as well, but it's been a joy, and glad to hear it's helping people like you mentioned this last week. We had a short. It was the one firearm preemption law extending to knives. On the face of that, when we originally recorded that segment and then turned it into a short, I thought, oh, this is going to be one of those shorts that it's going to get maybe a couple hundred. It's going to get some views, but it's not really going to be a heavy hitter. And it exploded to like, I think, 9,000 or something like that. And I sat back and was like, wait a second, why is this? And I was like, oh, Idaho, firearms, knives. I should have seen that. It's kind of a topic that's a little popular here in Idaho, which we are actually working on a story. I think I was going to talk about it this week, but we pushed it out a little further so to make sure we get it well researched and well rounded for one of these segments. But firearms in Idaho, we love them so very, very much. With all that said, talking about the channel and details and stuff, one thing I did do to get out of the office and just researching, because it's good to research. I'm very glad to do it for the show, but I went out with a good friend on Wednesday to take a trip up to McCall. I know for those living up there probably know about it, but there was some concerns about the lack of snow, because usually in January and February there's a lot of snow up there. So much so that we talked about on one of the midweek reports the winter carnival having to be pushed out an extra week because there just wasn't enough snow or wasn't cold enough, combination thereof. But I've been watching the weather reports, and you guys had a bunch of snow leading up to it. And then Wednesday was just this beautiful, barely any wind, a high of 30 or something. And we drove up there, and it was so pretty. I got some drone shots and stuff that looked really good. It was just gorgeous. It was so nice to get up there, and the weather was amazing. Which, have you been up there, John, in like the middle of winter season, or have you just been up there in the summer?
I've just been up there in the summer. I have not made it up into northern Idaho during the winter yet. It's definitely something that I'd like to do, because, you know, I enjoy snow, I enjoy winter. I would love to make it out there at some point.
So we went up the
Nice.
Weiser way. So the main way most people go is up through Eagle and Horseshoe Bend. You're going that way. But you can go the other side where you head a little bit more west over towards Payette, and you go through Weiser and then Council, and then you come to New Meadows and you kind of come down. We did that, and it was just gorgeous. That was kind of an open shot looking back towards the way up from Weiser. Snow everywhere. It was glittering. It was blue skies. There was barely any wind, so it was cool. Occasionally, you'd have like some trees that would slough off some snow.
Yeah.
And that was really cool. Let me see. I got to take the drone and fly it through a little bit of the river that's next to it there, a creek or whatever you want to call it. I could be having the worst day ever, but as long as there's snow in my life, I am a happy camper.
Dude, there's definitely something magical about snow.
Well,
It
even the
is
sound
very
element
special.
of it. As a person,
Yeah.
me and you, John, both, have some backgrounds in sound design and stuff. It soundproofs like the whole world around you.
Yeah, it's definitely awesome.
But yeah, it was, I would say probably maybe between 2 or 3 feet of snow was out there. I understand, when you're walking next to the pathways, because McCall was funny. You have all the roads that are plowed, right? And the walkways or sidewalks that are plowed. But then there'd be parts where you're going into buildings and stuff, and so there's snow. And so you would see the upper part of people, but not their legs.
Right? So I've not been up north here in Idaho, but I've definitely spent time in Colorado in the winter and northern New Mexico in the winter. Winter in the mountains is beautiful.
Yeah.
I'll have to get up north at some point during the winter just to see stuff.
Well,
Like,
I was actually really surprised. ITD, for a government website, they actually have a pretty nice interactive website now. I was able to actually go look at the road conditions and different stuff, and they were fairly accurate before we drove up there. So if you're a person who wants to go up north and is like, well, if the roads are clear, my Corolla can do it, but if they're not clear, it's not happening. So I would say that's been an immense resource when we went on that trip and other ones lately, that it's actually pretty accurate and not super hard to work with. You can see they're different colored, like on the level of no reports. You can also, it'll show you where cameras are, and then you can click on them and then see the photos of the road area.
That's kind of cool.
I didn't realize this now that I'm looking at it, but for those that know about it, there's Waze. I actually use it as a navigation application. You can turn it on here that like integrates into it. It's pretty actually full-fledged. And so far as I've experienced, they keep it pretty well up to date.
Yeah, no, this is a really cool thing that I'm glad I know about now. So when I'm looking to do traveling, especially really anywhere, this would be a great thing to take a look at before leaving. That's awesome.
In any case, that was my week. Kind of the snow trip up to McCall. Plus, for anyone out there that's had some issues with weather-related things or fires and stuff because of the weather conditions, our thoughts and prayers to you. But with that said, we will move on to our 3 stories for this week. Starting off with our first one that I know when I've talked to different people around the state, don't even know Idaho does it. House Bill 617, Idaho's Needle Exchange Program. Yes, you heard me right there. In 2019, Idaho joined states like California, Oregon, and Washington in implementing a syringe needle exchange program. It was hoped that the program would reduce the transmission of blood-borne illnesses among drug users. However, it has sparked a contentious debate across the state, with critics arguing that it inadvertently subsidizes and perpetuates drug addiction. Also, that it doesn't solve the root problem, but rather ensures that individuals can continue their drug use under the guise of safety. Thus, House Bill 617 has come to try to get rid of the program, in the spirit of saying that taxpayers don't want their dollars to go to clean needles, and that the most loving thing to do is not to remove consequences for people's actions. Which, with that said, what exactly is the program?
So the program was designed to provide clean needles to drug users to prevent the spread of bloodborne illnesses such as HIV and Hep C, which is a really good thing. Those are bad diseases. That said, they should only provide clean needles and shouldn't actually help addicts with using the needles, which is also a good thing. We don't need nurses shooting up our addicts. That's probably not a thing we want to be paying for. The reason for this is that last month, on February 16th, a report came from the East Idaho News about one of the Idaho harm reduction projects being rated for drug paraphernalia, which then caused the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare to announce an internal review of their working with IHRP. According to a spokesperson from the Boise police, officers seized electronic devices and packaged drug paraphernalia. So there are problems with this. Tyler, what does this bill actually say that's going to solve the problem, though?
Well, for once, I will say the Idaho legislature has outdone themselves, and they've written a very short bill.
What?
Yes, it can be done, and here is an example of it. Nice. The first part of the section of the bill says Chapter 34, Title 37, Idaho Code to be, and the same is thereby repealed. So basically saying we're we're going back to what we had before. No needle exchange program. That's what we want. Second section, number 2, an emergency exists therefore, which emergency is thereby declared to exist. This act shall be enforced and effective on and after July 1st, 2024. So basically, if it gets into effect, there has to be a due date. This has to get removed. 2 parts, just go back to what we originally had, and we have to do it by a set date. But for those that are for the program, they generally argue around the area that it reduces the spread of infectious diseases, as we talked about earlier, between people who are injecting drugs, and is a soft landing to connect people with other treatments to hopefully get them out of their addiction to other health services and different stuff. And that's the argument for those for it, but what's the argument for those against it?
Yeah, those that argue against this say that it does encourage people to stay addicted, or maybe it's not encouraging people, but it does make it easier for others to get addicted by taking away one of the risks that happen with doing those types of drugs. Not to mention that most people don't actually seem to want their tax dollars to be paying for clean needles for drug addicts. That's not necessarily a thing we want to be paying for.
Yeah, it's like saying I'm willingly going to help make sure there's more cookies in the cookie jar for the child I know that keeps stealing them and overeating on them. No, I don't want to do that. But I mean, purely on that stance of the money part of it. We can go back and forth about the ethical, which we will get into that more, but on the base level, the people, as we've talked about other times, should have a voice in where their tax dollars are going to. It's their money. It's getting put into the government, and we live in a representative government, and so they should have the right to say, I want that and I don't want that. I don't have a poll to cite, but I'm pretty confident in Idaho, especially because you see how the rest of our drug laws are in the state. We don't like people doing drugs, and we don't want to encourage it. So I really doubt the average person either 1, knows, or 2, wants this type of thing to be happening with their money.
Well, given the fact that marijuana is still illegal here in Idaho, which, take it or leave it, I'm kind of ambivalent on marijuana as a drug in and of itself. But the fact that we in Idaho still have marijuana be illegal makes me think that we probably don't want hard drugs to be legal or to be accessible. Just based on that fact that marijuana is illegal, we don't want people doing drugs.
Right.
So, yeah, I can definitely get down with not spending money on clean needles for addicts. Now, that does bring up the question, though, of how do we help people? Because one of the things that we do want, and one of the things that we're called to do as people, is how do we help those that are vulnerable? And you mentioned it earlier, it starts with parenting, I think, where we need to teach and train our children to not be addicted to things and then be able to discern right from wrong and good from bad.
Mm-hmm.
And as true as that is, that doesn't actually solve the problem of the addict. That might solve part of the problem of the next generation, but that doesn't solve the problem that we currently have right now. And so while I do agree that not having diseases like hepatitis C or HIV transfer as much, I agree that's a good thing. I don't know if this is something that our government should be spending money on, especially if we can't point to studies that say that these diseases are spreading at rates that are
threatening to the fabric of our communities.
Right, and they're threatening to the general population. Now, if we were having a hepatitis C outbreak where everybody and their brother were getting this disease, then yeah, we would want to take drastic steps to stop this problem from continuing and really try to figure out what the root causes are.
Right. And from what I've been reading, and also, you're not regularly seeing hospitals crammed with people for something like that, right?
Yeah.
I think that would also be a testament. It's discouraged to do drugs. But similarly, on that vein, it seems like, if I'm being generous, both sides are coming from a loving place. They look at the addict and say, you're a human being, I have some decency for you. One side says, you just need to stop doing the drugs, which I get it. It can be hard to do. Any addiction is hard to break, right? But there's the other side that says, well, the addiction's hard, and we're not going to try to figure out per se how to solve the addiction, but we are going to at least make it so that while you're trying to work through that addiction, you don't horribly get yourself with a disease or something. And in a sense, both of those come from a loving place in theory. But I think at the core of it, you need to really look, what is the most loving thing to do for a person? I think it's something that also applies to so many other topics in our society and that we've kind of forgotten in our modern modernity, is that sometimes the most loving thing to do for a person is to tell them the truth, not to pull away the consequences from them. This is a very stark example, and I don't want to be called for doing straw man, but I'm trying to make my example, and I'll boil it down to something more practical. But if you have a friend, or not even a friend, just a human being, that they are actively running towards a cliff, the most loving thing for you to tell that person is you're running off a cliff and you shouldn't do that, and you should get in their way to stop them from running off the cliff. Now, for this example, the person might be sitting there and saying, no, I want to go off the cliff. I want to go off the cliff. It doesn't matter about that they have consent to run off the cliff. They're an image bearer of God, and we're supposed to protect human life. And so you're to stop them from running off the cliff. So bringing that all down here with similar things, one side, they want to alleviate the diseases, but part of the reason that disease occurs, that root cause, is because they have an addiction. And that is one of the consequences of that vice. And so I would say we should address the root cause of, one, how do they get addicted, or to help them get out of their addiction. And not only that, for people outside of that might be tempted to not remove the consequences, because sometimes there's people that wouldn't even get into that vice. But if you remove the consequences of an action, example with the person running off the cliff, instead of stopping them from running off the cliff, but you just make a nicer pillow at the bottom of it, so there's a higher chance when they jump off the cliff they won't die, you haven't solved the problem then. The most loving thing is to help them at the beginning, part one, to be like, no, you shouldn't run off the cliff. And secondly, if you have run off the cliff, to give them that medical attention when they're at the bottom of it.
Right. Well, I think there's two questions in play. The first one, I think, is a really easy question to answer, and it's this. What is the purpose of our government? Right. And I think the purpose of our government, and we've talked about this ad nauseum, the purpose of our government is, one, to protect us from foreign adversaries, and two, to provide us civil stability. That's about it. Those are the things that our government should be doing. They are protecting us from outside. They're protecting us from inside the country. They are ensuring that our God-given rights are protected. Now, right. Do you have a God-given right to pump drugs into your system using a clean needle that's provided for you by someone else? No, I would say not, because that's saying that you have a God-given right to someone else's something, which that's not how rights work. So for the first question, is this something the government should be doing? I don't think this should fall under the purview of the government. That's thing number one. Question number two, though, is exactly on the line that you're talking about. And so if we want to help people that have addictions, if we want to help people that are mentally unstable, one, who should be doing that? And two, how should that be done? So the answer to the first question, I think, honestly, and you look through history, I think that typically falls to the church. We talked about this on last week's show. Who is it that actually gives money to nonprofit organizations? Well, it's Republicans. Now, I guess, we're talking about overlapping Venn diagrams here, but who are the people in the Republican Party that give money to charity organizations? I don't have any information to back this up, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's Christians by and large. So who are the people that are actually giving money to support causes? Well, it's Christians. Right. Or at least it's churchgoers. But those are the organizations that should be there to provide that help for people that need that help. That's the job of the church. And so then the question becomes, okay, so it's not a government job. It is a church's job. How does the church actually help these people? And you answered the question, I think, really well, is you don't solve the problem by solving the consequences. You don't heal a giant cut by just slapping a Band-Aid over it and hoping it heals. And then you peel the Band-Aid back and you go, oh no, it's festering. So you put that Band-Aid back and then you slap another Band-Aid over it. And then next week you peel it off and you go, oh, it's even worse. So you put that back and now you cast the arm. Covering up a problem isn't actually solving the underlying issues. You've got to get in there and you've got to clean out all of the junk that's in that cut that's infecting it before the cut can actually heal. And I think its thing is true with this. We have to ask why. Why are people addicted? What is it that people are running from? Why is it that people are drawn to these things? And then we can help people after that. But it goes back to who should be doing this work and then how should it be done.
Right. And springboarding off that, I think there would be way less controversy, especially, I didn't specifically put it in the notes here, but it is something I'm going to point out. The program that is doing this for the state is a nonprofit in the sense that the state is funding to be the middleman for it. But if a nonprofit is doing this and people are actively choosing to give their money to that thing, then that's one thing. It's another thing when the state as a whole is going and funding these programs and different things that I would personally argue aren't good for the fabric of society. They don't encourage virtue. They don't encourage you to be an independent individual that's trying to be productive in society and add to the general fabric of your community. This is just trying to be like, oh yeah, there's that consequence for that action you shouldn't have done. The government's going to make it a lot softer for you. And I guess that also pulls into my last point that I teased earlier on. We shouldn't remove the consequences for bad actions, but rather we should make it harder for people to do bad things. And if they do, we should help them with the consequences after it and how to not have or do that thing again.
I agree with you to a certain extent, but it comes down again to the question of who should be doing that work. And I don't think the government should be doing that work. If this is something that is truly plaguing our society, then our society needs to be the ones that do this work. Because we've seen time and time again that government doesn't know how to solve problems. It's ill-equipped to handle, and so getting as much out of the hands of our government as we possibly can seems like it's a good idea.
At least having the institutions that are designed to handle those things do it. The government has its role and its function. There's the role of government and the role of the church. And can the government try to do the role of the church? Well, yeah, you can.
But they can try.
It's not going to go well. We should use things for their intended uses. And I would argue that the intended use and role of the church and the community is more for this rather than the government.
We covered that a little bit earlier. We said, what is the purpose of government? Government has a purpose, and we want that purpose to be there. I would agree with you. We're not anarchists here. We need a government. The government is an institution that was designed and crafted by God, given to man for our betterment. So yes, government is important, but government has a sphere in which it works. And outside that sphere, it doesn't work well.
And so all that comes together. I wanted to talk about this because the more I talked about this or briefly mentioned it, a lot of people did not know this was going on, even if this was a program in Idaho. And to let you guys, one, know that this discussion is happening, and then two, it's also passed the House as of the reading of this story. And if I remember correctly, either first reading in the Senate or first reading in committee for the Senate, and that's coming Friday, March 8th. So if this is something that you agree with us on and you want this bill to move forward and for this program to be repealed and to go back to what Idaho was before 2019, then write your senator, reach out to them, let them know. It's all the goal that we have here is stay informed. Or if it's something that you really are passionate that you want that program, we haven't swayed you, then there again, please be involved, make your voice heard in that sense. Now, speaking of things in society, moving on to our next one here, the rise of Boise. Brooks reports highlights growth and gaps. So across the state, as we have all heard the reports and probably seen the growth, there's no place that knows that better than Boise / the Ada County area, which has experienced a remarkable amount of growth over the last 2 decades or so. This is highlighted by a recent report from the Brooks Institute, in which they have looked at the Boise metropolitan statistical area, encompassing Ada, Boise, Canyon, Gem, and Owyhee counties, where they pointed out a surge in growth, prosperity, and inclusion, with significant changes in the racial inclusion as well. Don't worry, I'm not crazy about the race part. More on that later, how it's actually kind of a good thing. According to the report, Boise ranks second out of the 55 large metropolitan areas for growth, with a 40.5% increase in jobs and a 60.2% rise in gross metropolitan products from 2012 to 2022. The numbers of jobs at young firms has also skyrocketed by 80.9%, indicating a robust entrepreneurial ecosystem, which I know we hear about growth a lot and different stuff going on in the state, and it just sounds like another report. But bear with me. This one was actually very interesting, and I think it would be helpful. But before we can really dive into that, I think we need to understand the methods and who the Brookings Institution is.
Right. So the Brookings Institution is a nonprofit public policy organization, and it's based in Washington, D.C. Their stated aim is to conduct in-depth, nonpartisan research to improve policy and governance at local, national, and global levels. They were founded in 1916 as the Institute for Government Research by Robert S. Brookings, who was a merchant, a manufacturer, and a philanthropist. And there were also some other people involved in that founding. But with that said, their stated goals are to strengthen American democracy, foster the economic and social welfare, security, and opportunity of all Americans, and secure a more open, safe, prosperous, and cooperative international system. So there are some more left-leaning ideas in there, but they have been trusted for some time, and from what we can see, they're generally trustworthy. So the next question then is, how did they make this report? Well, as for how they did this, they attempted to assess the United States growth by looking at 3 different sizes of metropolitan areas, totaling 194 areas. The 3 groups are broken down into very large metropolitan areas with populations above 1 million, large metro areas that are between 250 and 1 million, and then mid-sized metro areas with populations of at least 250,000. So the Boise area does land in that large category of between 250,000 and 1 million.
So if you take that ranking and we're third, how are we third in the nation? Well, we're third in the nation for that metropolitan area between 250,000 and 1 million. But if you were to compare us to over or above 1 million, then we look small. So kind of that context there.
Right. So it's important to know. It's important to know, especially when you're looking at statistical analysis, what the bounds of that analysis are. The next thing to be aware of is how the Brookings Institute is actually scoring these things. So they're scoring this based on 5 areas: growth, prosperity, overall inclusion, and then racial inclusion and geographic inclusion. So growth, they're looking at real GDP, total employment, jobs at young firms. For prosperity, they're looking at wages, productivity, and then standards of living. Overall inclusion is employment rate, median earnings, relative poverty. Racial inclusion is an unemployment gap, I guess white versus people of color, and then an earnings gap or a poverty gap. And then geographic inclusion is neighborhood employment gap, neighborhood earnings gap, and then a neighborhood poverty gap.
Which on that neighborhood poverty gap, the interesting part about that is they're actually taking, I think it's it might be both the earnings and poverty one, but they're taking those analytics based on the top 20% in a given area and the top lowest 20% and then comparing the difference in that gap. Right.
Well, because we all know that when there are economic disparities, that's when things get weird. And that's when conflict happens. If we're all poor together, then it's fine. It doesn't really matter. If we're all rich together, that's fine. We're all the same. But if I'm living next to Elon Musk, well, that's no longer okay. Like, I live a comfortable life. I drive a car. I have a house. That's great. Elon Musk owns rocket ships and can go to space. We're on completely different planes. And
or
so
planets, you might say. Sorry, I couldn't help it.
Almost. That's funny. And so, if I'm comparing myself next to Elon Musk, well, clearly it looks like I'm very, very poor, even though I'm doing pretty darn good. And
right.
So I think that's where these poverty gaps, or the earnings, poverty, and employment gap, they really are important, because that neighborhood needs to be cohesive, at least in that sense.
Right. And I wouldn't have chosen the language. I think they're trying to get some winnings on the DEI score with the word inclusion. But that's why I wanted to have these subcategories when we were talking about it. Because, yes, they're saying geographic inclusion. I would have not used that verbiage. That is totally modern vernacular, but I wanted to be accurate to how they're defining it. I probably would have gone with, there's a specific word in statistics that it's talking about the level of deviation between 2 different data sets. That word, whoever's out there that does statistics, you'll know what I'm talking about. I would have done that instead of inclusion. Same with the racial part there again. and the overall part, not overall inclusion, racial inclusion, geographic inclusion, because it's just a modern overused term. And then for all this data that we are looking at here, the main two they used were the U.S. Census Bureau for their data and EMSI estimates. And diving into that a little bit for those exact details for this area and coming back to Idaho, we in the large categories we talked about earlier come in second out of across the entire nation. In our jobs area, so changes in jobs. Jobs measures the total number of occupied full-time wage, salaries, employment positions. Okay, yeah, so basically jobs people hold. So in the job sector, jobs and change, over the course of from 2012 to 2022, we had 40.5% growth in that area. Changes in gross metropolitan products, so GDP, we had 60.2% growth over that period. And we also had 80.9% growth in jobs at young firms. So basically new businesses, small businesses, stuff like that, which kind of, as they're saying, and I would agree with that data, that shows that entrepreneurial businesses are welcome to get started. Now, the question does become how long they last. That report doesn't quite get into it. That would be another thing to look at. But it is a good indicator that people in Idaho love to start businesses and they're able to achieve those and actually even hire people for jobs beyond just themselves for that. Then getting poverty topic, we rank 5th in the nation for large, same period, 2012 to 2022. We ranked 12th for change in productivity, so we had an increase of 14%. We came in number 6 for a change in average annual wages, so we had a 21.5% increase in wages over that period. Then we also ranked 5 in the nation for large when it came to changes in standards of living. We had a 25.9% according to their evaluation. Which then that brings us on to the overall inclusion rating. That's where we start getting into areas where obviously the elite don't like us as much. In conclusion, we come in about 13 out of all of the large ones, which you wouldn't expect us to do that. One of that is a change in employment rate. That we come in 34th out of all the large cities in the United States that they looked at a 4.6% increase over that period of time. We came in number 5th for change in median earnings, so we had a 31.2% increase, so people getting raises, more money on the median there. And then 13, a change in relative poverty rate, so we had a 4% decrease over that period overall of poverty, so just saying that people are less poor by a factor of 4%, which is good to hear at 13. Then on the racial inclusion part, we came in number 10. I don't know if that's just because we don't have a lot of different minority groups in Idaho besides Mexicans, but anywho, we came in number 8th for change in white/people of color employment rate gap. So that came by negative 0.7%, basically saying if you have one line, that's the amount of money that Hispanic or other people are getting, and then another line for all the white people, the difference between those two, how close they are, they got closer, in a sense, by 6.7%. This is the part that kind of stunk, I guess, a little bit more. We come 37th in the nation, so that's change in white/people of color median earnings gap. It increased by $550. And then we came in at number 9 and change in white/people of color relative poverty rate gap at a negative 6.1%. And in geographic inclusion, we came in 50th in the nation. So at 44, we came change in top/bottom neighborhoods employment rate gap. It increased by 1.5%. Change in top/bottom neighbors medium household income gap. Came in 50th there at 17,257. So that's that difference between the top people and the bottom people, that medium amount of income per household. So being a little bit larger. And then we came in 38th in change in the bottom to top neighborhoods relative poverty rate gap at about negative 3.6%. So lots of words, lots of things. You're welcome to go read the article. Doing this over audio is not the best. In a perfect world, we would have more of some info, and who knows, maybe this week as we're editing it, John will have some of these things up. We'll see if time allows, we'll put it that way. One of the things when I was reading this article, and I thought it was just the beginning natural objection someone might give, is how is this a good thing for Idaho? And from that, a lot of people in Idaho, many I love dearly, will say Idaho doesn't need to get any bigger. What made it great is being washed away by that growth. If we keep growing the way we are, we're not going to be the Idaho that was to attract that greatness to begin with, right? The initial answer I would give to that is, one, a bit of a monetary only answer, but that bringing more money into the state isn't a bad thing. Having that greater income coming into the state means for skilled workers, which we have that, we have U of I, we have CWI, we have BSU that train some pretty competent people. If you have more money coming into the state for more skilled jobs, that means those people who probably have already grown up here and really love the state can actually stay here and contribute towards the state in different ways and stuff rather than leaving and going off to other places. And so we invested all this money and time, and then these people just disappear, which is another segment. We're going to dive into that deeper later on and probably the next month. But the part I want to focus on a little bit more about that worry of growth part. You should probably then be more involved in the political aspect so that you can direct that growth, because you're not going to be able to stop it, as we've talked about multiple times in the show.
Yeah, growth is going to happen, and I'm living proof of that. We moved here in 2019, so shoot, that's 5 years ago now, which is a long time for me to be in a single place. But you're not going to stop people moving here. I've talked about that down in Austin. Austin was the same way. You weren't going to stop people from moving into Austin. We saw the same thing happen to Colorado, I don't know, decades ago, is a ton of people moved there. And the question is, how do you stop the place that you're living from changing to something that's not good? Well, we've also seen this in the United States. When people come in with the idea that they want to assimilate and become a part of the community that they're moving to, that's good. That's what we want to encourage. When people come in and say, wow, this is a cool place. I want this to be like my old place because my old place has good ideas. They just, I don't know, reasons are bad. So like we want people moving here who are passionate about the things that we want to have people be passionate about. And so, if you're passionate about something, well, then you should be involved in something. If you're not involved in something, and then you tell me, well, but I really want this thing to be that way. Okay, but do you? Because you're not involved.
Right.
So, like, get involved.
And also on that fact, I think Idaho thus far has done a really good job with it. One of the cool things about Idaho is, for lack of a better, our public perception to other states when, say, a person's sitting in California or sitting in Washington and thinking about, well, where should I move to? And they're looking down the list and they come to Idaho, right? The public perception of it is that it's really conservative, it's really rural, and if you don't like those things, it's not going to work out well, for lack of a better word. That's the marketing. And so that will naturally filter, actually, I think, a lot of people. And we've seen that, like we talked about, I think, a month or two back with the voter registry rolls of the people moving here and how they're registered. A lot of them are registered Republican. That doesn't mean they're going to vote exactly that. But it does show a certain sign that it is the public perception outside of our state when you're choosing to move does have that filtering effect. And to keep that filter up, to encourage that, we should try to be involved in our politics, so that the type of society we create attracts those that we want and repels those we don't want in our state.
It's very true. You're absolutely right.
But then coming into another part that I teased earlier we were going to get into, which is the racial part, and coming more from that fiscally conservative perspective. And if John, as I'm talking about this, you can go look at the chart if you're curious. Hispanic or any groups that aren't white in Idaho actually, on average, according to the median income, make more. And so in this, you could see the left just being like, this is a horrible thing. I actually think it's a great thing, but it was showing that the gap between those two, between white and then whatever else, because that's how we like to categorize things, because apparently, yay, we're going to do it that way, that shrunk, which I think is not a bad thing at all. It also is an encouraging thing that if you, so woe is me, I'm Hispanic and I came from somewhere else or whatever. No, on average in Idaho, you're actually going to be making more money than your white counterpart. Be that our culture, be that other things, be that work ethic that some of the Hispanics have in the Valley. I'm not going to get into that right now, but I would say seeing that those lines are coming closer, for lack of a better word, that everyone independent of race is making closer to the same income, I think is a decent thing. I'm not arguing for equality. I'm not arguing for socialism or something like that. But I think it's just an encouraging element to see that we're all doing better in that sense.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I mean, it seems to me that anything, or maybe not anything, but adding to your diversity does end up being a good thing in the long run. Having differing points of view is very important to being able to answer complicated and complex questions.
Right. And bringing this all broadly together, we talked about the race part, we're talking about the part of the growth and the fears that we have in the state, but just bringing that all together under one umbrella, I would say the takeaway from this is that, one, we're doing pretty great in Idaho for growth overall over the last couple of years, but overall that, one, we should be very thankful that we live in the state that we live in, and that we have the blessings the Lord has given us, that we have a thriving economy, that it's good that you can go start a small business, and that not to lose hope, because I think a lot of people right now, a lot of the news nationally, I'm not going to say that everything's sunshines and rainbows, right? But we also do, as human beings, need to actually have a conscious effort to look at the good things in life, because we'll naturally see all the bad things and the worries and concerns. But that for us on the Treasure Valley, that as a state, we're really, really blessed, and we should be really, really thankful for it. And that this is a good sign, and that, there's opportunity. Don't play the victim card. You live in a wonderful, wonderful state that all the numbers that we see currently, they're going up. We're doing better. But thankfully, we're in a little bit of a safer place if things get worse in other areas. But hey, if you've made it this far in the episode, hopefully that means you've enjoyed the show getting that far. So don't forget to hit the subscribe button or follow button on YouTube, Rumble, or Twitter. Please like and share it. Also, for our audio-only listeners, please rate the show and leave us a review. Thank you for your support and being part of the local yokel Idaho community. Together, hopefully we can keep Idaho informed, engaged, and involved in this wonderful state. Now, let's dive back into our next story. Which, as we got through all those heavy things and getting into some more fun social things, and this is something that you may have actually seen, halfway between the equator and the North Pole, Idaho's 45th parallel markers. Something you may have seen while driving to northern Idaho or coming down to the southern part of the state. There is an intriguing geographic marker that is nestled within the scenic landscape of Idaho that not only offers a unique educational opportunity, but also serves as a fascinating destination for families exploring the state. The 45th parallel is an invisible line that circles around the globe. It marks the halfway point between the equator and North Pole. This line of latitude runs through several locations in Idaho, including the notable marker at Highway 95 in New Meadows, about 12 miles north of McCall, if you kind of need a little context there, and then another one at Highway 28 south of Salmon next to Lemhi River. These markers provide a more tangible kind of connection there to the abstract concept that can be global geography, making them a definite visit for those traveling and residing in the state. Now, with this said, I know geography can be a boring topic for some people, but I think this is one that's going to be really interesting, or at least it'll be helpful to know on those trivia nights when you need to score someone up. But the first question generally is, when I was researching this, which is, what is the 45th parallel?
Well, the 45th parallel is a circle of latitude that is at 45 degrees north or south from the Earth's equator, which, for those not familiar with some of those terms, think of a ball and draw lines on it from the top to the bottom, equidistant from each other. That's the longitude. You can remember that because it has to be long to get from the top to the bottom. Then you draw another set of lines on the ball that go around it, starting with a loop at the bottom and making equidistant loops until you get to the top. That's the latitude. You can remember those because it's like a ladder, latitude, ladder. You climb it as you go from the bottom to the top. As for what the equator is, for anyone who doesn't know, it's the halfway point between the North and the South Poles. If you cut it in half, then you would have the northern and the southern hemispheres. So what makes this special? Well, one reason is that the southern 45th parallel is mainly in the ocean. 97% of it is covered by water, so you really can't see most of it. However, the northern 45th parallel passes through several countries and regions around the world, including parts of Europe, North America, and Asia. The second is, if you live in Boise or Pocatello, you're closer to the equator than you are to the North Pole. And on the flip side, if you live north of New Meadows, like in Lewiston or Moscow, you're actually closer to the North Pole than you are the equator. So it's kind of cool. And then thirdly, it marks an interesting middle point in the state for daylight hours, because Idaho is a more extended state from north to south. In New Meadows, near the 45th parallel, the longest day of the year occurs during the summer solstice on June 20, 2024, with a daylight length of 15 hours and 40 minutes. And then the shortest day of the year is during the winter solstice on December 20, with a daylight length of 8 hours and 49 minutes. For comparison, on June 28 up north, Sandpoint has a daylight duration of 16 hours and 22 minutes, from sunrise at 4:48 a.m. to sunset at 9:10 p.m. That's a lot of sun. And then in the south, Boise's at 15 hours and 18 minutes, significantly less.
All these things, I know, getting a bit of terms and different stuff, but one, you won't actually see some mountain range or something different like that. But it does have effects, especially with the daylight element. That's one part I didn't know while researching this of how drastic it would be. And then the other part that for me that was also eye-opening was that most of the time we think of Idaho as a pretty northerly state, right? And we think we're in the mountains, we're in the north, right? But half of the state and where most of us live in the state are actually closer to the equator than we are the North Pole. Now, if you're up in Sandpoint, then yeah, you have the right understanding of all the pines and trees and snow and stuff. Yeah, you're definitely more further north in that sense. But it's something that I also didn't realize because I always thought, yeah, just Idaho's more northernly, and that's what we are.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you start looking at the geographical landmarks that are in and around the United States. I remember looking at being in Colorado and going to the Continental Divide. And there's a sign on the highway that's like, this is the Continental Divide. And you're like, that's so cool. On this side, the water goes that way. And on that side, the water goes the other way. And it's really cool. And there was a point that was made earlier that it's a way to help connect you to the world around you. And I think that's something that's so important, and so important for us as young people who are growing up in this world, and especially for the young people, for my children. One of the most important things for them to realize is this world is so much bigger than you, which is a really good thing because it connects you to the world around you, even though you're a really small part of it. The exciting thing is that individuals can do big things that change a lot, but still, you're a small piece of the puzzle. And that's a really good thing to know.
You can be fearful about that, about how massive creation is, or you can, I would say as a believer, a Christian, you can praise the Lord for how wonderful and how vast and how beautiful it truly is, that he created this place for us to both explore and to understand, to be good stewards over, and to have dominion over. With this, I think it's a really cool element, especially I know there's a lot of hiking trails that are up towards New Meadows. If you're just traveling there, the kids, maybe, especially for homeschool families, wink, wink, been there, done that. It might be a really cool spot to just stop, stretch your legs, and then say, hey, look, kids, and then explain this and go through this to just be an interesting part to ground you to understanding, yeah, this is a cool part that in North America we get to see rather than the northern, or the southern one you're not able to see quite as much.
It is a pretty darn cool thing, and one that I'm excited to know about.
Right. Bringing it all together, that's our last story here, our fun one. Thank you for listening to the entire podcast. I sincerely hope you found it enjoyable and valuable. If we missed any important points or provided incorrect information, please feel free to reach out to us by email at localyocalidaho@gmail.com or on Twitter by tweeting me at localyocalidaho. With the small team we have here, we're not able to cover everything, but we do our best to cover the most interesting and important stories. Thank you for your continued support and assistance. That's all for now, and I wish you a fantastic rest of your week. Godspeed.